Thank you so much, Anne. I appreciate it. So, as Anne said, my name is Holliday Vega, and I am the librarian for health psychology and social work at the University of Chicago. And today I'm going to talk about critical pedagogy in remote instruction. Like many of you during the pandemic, I had to shift my entire teaching, instruction, reference consultations over to remote environment. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what that looked like for me and how I was able to incorporate my foundational principles for teaching, which is critical pedagogy, into a remote environment for instruction. So this is a little bit about me. So I am white. I'm cisgender. I'm queer. I have PTSD. I'm a feminist. I'm an antiracist. I love unicorns. And so why am I telling you all of this? So this concept was inspired by anthropologist Laila Abu-Lughod, as well as other scholars both within the field of librarianship and in other fields. So identifying ourselves and locating ourselves and acknowledging how our identities impact the way we move through the world and we experience the world is a really important part of critical and engaged pedagogy, because we all live at intersections of privilege as well as at systems of oppression. And we bring those identities with us into the classroom. Now, in in-person environment, there's things about myself that I disclose simply by bringing my body into that space. So like the fact that I'm white, the fact that I'm female presenting, the fact, like all these things that I can't really hide, like the fact that I'm a larger bodied person. And there's things that in the remote environment are still able to be identified about me as well if I have my camera on, although as we know, Zoom, we can opt out of that if you want to. So there's parts of my identity that are visible, and there's parts of my identity that are not. And if I don't acknowledge them, I can't dismantle those systems of oppression. So if I'm not dismantling white supremacy within myself, I'm not going to be able to dismantle white supremacy in my teaching practice. And I might actually be upholding racist structures or systems of white supremacy in my teaching if I'm not actively working to dismantle that within myself. As one example. So that's why I talk a little bit about my identities and how those impact my teaching, my beliefs, my values, my practice, and things that I have to challenge within myself. So this is a lot of books. So I, like many of you, have to read articles, books to really inform my practice, not only with teaching, but also with reference interactions and research support. And these are some books that have really inspired me. There's a couple of these on here that I haven't read, including this book, which was published during the pandemic, Race, Politics, and Pandemic Pedagogy, Education in a Time of Crisis. If you're only going to read one book out of this list, I highly recommend Teaching to Transgress, Education is the Practice of Freedom by Bell Hooks. And these are all really, really great books about information literacy, social justice, critical pedagogy, feminist pedagogy. There's a book here specifically for feminist pedagogy for library instruction by Maria T. Accardi. And these are all really, really incredible books about critical pedagogy, and some of them do talk about incorporating critical pedagogy into a remote environment as well. So what is critical pedagogy? What's feminist pedagogy? So Paulo Freire, who wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he was a Brazilian scholar, and he is regarded as the founder of critical pedagogy by many scholars. Bell Hooks, Henry Giroux, and others have built upon the work of Paulo Freire. And Bell Hooks, in her book Teaching to Transgress, she critiques Paulo Freire and applies a feminist and anti-racist approach to critical pedagogy, but she does this in a way that doesn't discount anything that he brought that was of value. She still appreciates the value that he brings to pedagogical theory while critiquing his work as well. So Paulo Freire, he opposed this idea of the banking method of education. So this is the concept that teachers are the holders of all knowledge, and we are imparting that knowledge onto students who are empty vessels just waiting to be filled with the knowledge that we are imparting on them. So it views instructors as the ones who hold all of the authority in the classroom, and students don't bring anything with them. They're just empty vessels to be filled. So they're being like, we're approaching it from this like banking method. We're depositing knowledge. And he strongly opposed this method. So instead of a lecture style, which would uphold this banking method, he would be more likely to promote a teaching style that is discussion-based and engaging students in critical dialogue with the material, and also viewing students as holders of knowledge themselves. Students bring knowledge with them into the classroom space. He also had this idea of critical consciousness. So this is the idea that students, the goal of teaching and of education is to empower learners to become aware of and dismantle systems of oppression and to work towards liberation. So Freire believes that this critical consciousness is the goal of education, which is why I talked about dismantling systems of white supremacy, and I'll talk more about that. But like hierarchical structures and sexist, oppressive structures, the goal of education should be to work towards dismantling those structures. This is a quote of Bell Hooks, one of many quotes that I'll share with you today. I love Bell Hooks. Again, Teaching to Transgress. If you're going to read one book about critical pedagogy, I would recommend that one. Making the classroom a democratic setting where everyone feels a responsibility to contribute is a central goal of transformative pedagogy. So one way of making the classroom a democratic space, when we're in person, we could all sit in a circle, and the instructor could sit in the circle with the students. But how do we recreate that sort of democratic setting over Zoom, for example? And it should be easier, right? Because there's no podium, there's no pedestal where an instructor is seated. But it's a little more complicated than that. As many of you may know, it's harder to get engagement over Zoom, or I have found it to be harder to get engagement over Zoom. So who was Bell Hooks? So this is a little information about her. So Bell Hooks is a feminist scholar who writes about engaged pedagogy and transformative pedagogy. And her approach is that education is a practice of freedom. So our goal is to empower students and liberate students to become critical thinkers. And Hooks also emphasizes well-being into teaching practice. Students and teachers are both actively engaged, and both teachers and students are empowered to learn and grow. So it's a collaborative process instead of the banking method that Paulo Freire discussed. So education is more collaborative, and I'll talk more about that because it is difficult to have a collaborative instruction session, especially if you're teaching a one-shot session and you're not having any sort of a follow-up with that group of students. This is another quote by Bell Hooks that I think is particularly relevant to information literacy and to librarianship. It becomes most evident that part of our contemporary crisis is created by a lack of meaningful access to truth. And this is so, I think it'll always be current, but I think back to the early pandemic, even today, the way that folks are talking about vaccines, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so using that as an example, how can we take that from current events, something that's happening right now, something that's affecting all of us, and use that as an example to how to identify what's actually accurate information and how to wade through all of this misinformation that's out there. Maria Tiaccardi, so she's the author of the book Feminist Pedagogy for Library Instruction. She also views instruction and teaching as an active process. She's a big fan of active learning, and it's a collaborative process, similar to bell hooks. Learning should be a collaborative experience where students are teaching the teachers, and teachers are not just teaching, but also learning from the students. So another concept Maria Tiaccardi strongly believes in, which I also strongly believe in, is that education and librarianship is always political. It can never be neutral. There's actually no such thing as neutrality. Instruction is an opportunity to empower students by creating an engaged, democratic, as non-hierarchical as possible collaborative classroom. Maria Tiaccardi also talks about seating students in a circle with the instructor sitting in the circle with the students. So there's no podium, there's no teacher standing up front, which is a way of very physically showing that this is a collaborative democratic space, and it's also actively opposing the banking method of education, which views the students as these empty vessels. Instruction is also an opportunity to raise consciousness about oppressive systems. So Maria Tiaccardi recommends using search examples to demonstrate concepts around feminism or anti-racism, and we can do that even in our instruction with the search examples we're using when we're showing students how to search a database. So applying critical pedagogy to library instruction. So some of the things that we can do is accept that students bring knowledge to the classroom with them. Students are the experts of their own experience. So just as we bring in our own experiences, our own identities, and that affects the way we move through the world, students are also bringing in their intersecting identities, which affects how they move through the world as well. We are learning together, so acknowledging that you may actually learn something from the students you're teaching, and viewing learning as a collaborative process. For one-shot sessions, problem-based learning is one approach to start incorporating a little bit of critical pedagogy. I've read some articles that take the stance that it's nearly impossible to truly incorporate critical pedagogy into a one-shot instruction because you're not really following the students with them on their journey towards critical consciousness. But we can always incorporate some of the values and principles to help them on that journey. So one way to approach this would be to ask students how they would start searching. So give them an example of a problem that they would need to search. So a subject of childcare, deaths in childbirth, and best interventions to prevent death in childbirth for nurses, for example, or for nursing students, asking them how they would start searching. Which database would you go to? What terms would you use? And asking students to start building the search from their own knowledge and their own resources that they're aware of and that they're already using. So bringing this into a remote environment came with some challenges. So for a lot of us, remote teaching came with a learning curve. A lot of folks have learned how to teach in person and using technology in the classroom, and not a lot about using Zoom or using Teams or using other remote platforms. It's also difficult to promote engagement, active engagement in a Zoom session. So cameras are often off. Students might be easily distracted. There's a lack of focus. Lots of us have lots of back-to-back Zoom meetings, so that's true for students as well. Zoom meetings with classmates and Zoom meetings, also Zoom or phone calls with their family and loved ones. And all of their classes now are online. So that's part of it too. Not seeing faculty and instructors and students regularly and more spontaneously as in person. So there's less ability to network, spread the word about library resources and instruction. And another challenge that I didn't write here, but I think we all faced is, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, it wasn't the same to hold students to the same expectations as before the pandemic, because we were all in this together, going through a global crisis. Lives were being lost, people were sick, there were so many unknowns, and it was a very scary time. So that's another aspect, particularly in the pandemic, that I would like to acknowledge, is that it was difficult for us to hold the same expectations of students, because they're going through this too, and they're scared. They might have loved ones who are sick. They might have loved ones who have passed away. So there was a lot of difficulty there with how can we hold people to the same expectation and go about a classroom session the same way that we would in normal times. So what led to success in remote instruction? Actively reaching out to instructors and to students really helped. Following up with them, checking in with them, letting them know what databases I could help with, citation management tools I could teach, and help specifically assignments that I helped with in the past. And I offered to help with any new assignments or any changes in assignments due to this shift in our entire school environment into a remote form. I also hosted introduction sessions at the start of fall quarter. So last year, the fall quarter of 2020, I held two open sessions for the psychology students, and I held 3 open sessions for the social work students. So I would hold one as a general introduction to library resources. Here's how you can access the library Articles Plus database. Here's how you can start searching. Here's how you can link your Google Scholar account to your library account so you can pull up those PDFs. Here is how to find an article. Here's how to put a request in through interlibrary loan. Very broad overview of the general resources we offered. And then I held another session, and actually 2 sessions in the case of the social work department, for specific databases. So I would use social services abstracts like Info and Scopus, or Web of Science in the case of the psychology students, to go through a little bit more in depth how to search, the basics of constructing a search and what Boolean operators are and how they work. That also really helped, particularly with the word of mouth of students getting to know that they have a librarian to help them with their research. It led to an increase in requests for research consultations. So those individual one-on-one sessions with students. But it actually also helped me connect back with the professors, because I would send out this email in the beginning of the quarter. I'd let the department know, I'd let the students know, as well as their instructors. So instructors started inviting me to their classes as well. So I started getting contacted, can you come to my class and provide an overview of Psych Info? We're going to be using this database for an assignment I have, and that actually really helped a lot. So I started building back those same connections as I'd had in person. And I actually got in touch with some instructors that I hadn't met yet. I actually started here at the University of Chicago just a few months before we were all sent home. So I actually have worked more remote than I have in person. So I also engaged with students and instructors via Teams. Some institutions are using Slack. I know a couple that are using Discord. We're using Teams here. So I would also have a link to Teams in my email signature. I set up an auto response, so it was triggered by certain requests and certain keywords that would send folks an auto response with, here's how to reach me via Teams. And this also really, really helped. We have an Ask a Librarian chat service that's in real time, and that has really helped students, but also being able to connect with me, even when I'm not working a chat shift necessarily, and chat with me in real time via this online messenger, that also really helped with getting more engagement with students and getting questions from instructors and rebuilding those sort of in-person interactions that we used to have in person, especially with the social work department. I have an office at CRAR, but I also have an office in the social work library, which is embedded in the social work school. And so I would see instructors all the time. So sort of trying to recreate that sort of spontaneous dropping by, chatting with instructors. I tried to recreate that as best I could in the remote environment. So during the online sessions specifically, I would often ask folks to turn on their cameras. However, I made it very clear that this is an option. It's optional. It's if folks feel comfortable. There's a variety of reasons that students may keep their cameras off. They may be in, they may not be in the best learning environment. They may have a lot of distractions behind them. They may have family members with them. They may have children, pets. They may just be in their pajamas because they're in a different time zone. There's so many reasons that students may not feel comfortable turning on their cameras, and not every student has access to a webcam. So there's also that aspect of it. So I would ask folks if they felt comfortable and made it very clear that it was optional to turn on their cameras. But I would encourage folks to engage in whatever way made sense for them. So if they couldn't unmute themselves, if they could type into the chat, whatever way they could interact and engage with the session. So for remote instruction, another way that I tried to actively engage students and incorporate critical pedagogy and approach this as a collaborative learning experience and encourage active engagement and active learning. I would often ask students at the beginning of the session to introduce themselves, and I would ask a question, and often that question was about what database they use or what do they use to find articles. In small groups, in small seminar classes with 7 or 8 people, this was very easy to ask folks to just unmute themselves and talk. In larger classes, that was a little more difficult, and so very early on, I instead of asking folks to unmute themselves if it was a larger class, I would ask everyone to just type into the chat, and I would wait and give everyone time and ask them to just type into the chat your name or your preferred name that you go by, pronouns if you feel comfortable sharing them, and a database you use or what you use to search for articles. So even if it's Google, that's fine. So that's part of meeting students where they're at as well. Again, this requires students to communicate vocally or via Zoom chats, and I wouldn't call anyone out for not sharing. I would only call on students who actually did choose to share. Because again, there's a variety of reasons that folks might not be typing into the Zoom chat or unmuting themselves to talk on the microphone. So meeting students where they're at is really, really important. But also meeting students where they're at when it comes to searching. So if Google is what they feel comfortable with, that's where I start. So if students are saying that they just search Google, I'll encourage them to start searching on Google Scholar instead of just Google. If they're familiar with Google Scholar, I'll show them how they can link their Google Scholar account to their library account so that they can use our Find It button to find it in our catalog, and to access the PDF of the articles they're finding. And this also, our Find It link will also direct them to request articles via interlibrary loan if for some reason we don't have it in our collection, if it's a journal we don't subscribe to. So that's another way of meeting them where they're at. So both meeting them where they're at when it comes to using microphone, turning their camera on or off, and meeting them where they're at in what they're familiar with and how they're starting to search. Another way of meeting them where they're at is understanding current events or using current events as an example, and also acknowledging what's happening. So for example, in a psychology course, so this was actually well into the pandemic. It was the beginning of winter quarter, and I knew that folks were stressed about the beginning of the quarter, about possibly coming back to campus, a whole variety of different things. So I started the session with this psychology seminar course with a breathing exercise. And I just asked everyone to take 3 deep breaths. And from there, I took that as a search example. So I asked the students, how would you start searching for evidence that this breathing exercise leads to a decrease in stress or an increase in feeling calm? And how would you start searching for that? And where would you start searching for that? So if you're using PsycInfo, if they're familiar with PsycInfo, what terms would you start using and how would you narrow down those terms? So I met them where they're at with their level of stress by bringing in an example of mindfulness meditation, and then using that as a search example. So really incorporating that into the instruction. Bell Hooks talks about this a little as well, with the importance of well-being and acknowledging well-being in teaching. And that's something that I try to do as well. Also in the beginning of the pandemic, like I think many of us did, and I think I was a little more fortunate because my population of students that I teach, psychology, social work, and nurses and nurse residents, it was a lot easier to incorporate COVID-19 searches, and a lot of them, particularly the nurses, were searching for information about COVID-19 for their practice. So I would also bring in current events, what was going on right now, questions people had about it, and use that as a search example. So that was especially important in the beginning of the pandemic as well. And again, to bring it back to the beginning, locating ourselves and our experiences is really important. Acknowledging that we're not just leaving our humanity at the door of the classroom when we engage in a classroom. So acknowledging that's what was on everyone's mind at the beginning of the pandemic. And even today, people are still asking questions about vaccines. There's a lot of questions about the Delta variant. So bringing that into the classroom and using that as a search and helping students identify, well, what makes an article more reliable? How do you identify misinformation here? How do you start critiquing this? I would also continuously ask for feedback throughout the session and for any questions. So I'd remind students throughout the session, you can type your questions into chat. And then for smaller groups, I would ask them to unmute themselves. I would, even in small groups, I would encourage them to use the Zoom chat function because even in smaller groups, students might not feel comfortable unmuting themselves. So I'd continuously ask if there's any questions, if I can go back and review anything. And that was also a way to continuously get engagement and active learning from the students. Sometimes I would call on students, especially in smaller groups, but sometimes also in larger classrooms. I would point out, you mentioned that you're searching for this topic. What database have you tried using, or what search terms have you tried using? So I would bring back what the students had shared about themselves and what databases they're using, what their topic was for their paper, and bring that back in the session to encourage people to engage more. I can also use search examples that incorporate feminist and anti-racist pedagogy, bringing it back to the example of preventing death in childbirth, using search strings about the rate of the outcomes for childbirth in Black women versus white women, which is something well known in the medical field, that Black women die at exponentially higher rates in childbirth than white women. So incorporating that into the search, looking at the medical literature that's talking about this, and using those examples to incorporate anti-racism and feminism into the instruction session. I would also educate students with critiques of databases. So the databases we use are not perfect. They use algorithms just like Google, and the journals that are indexed, the paywalls they hit, these are all proprietary decisions. And when I show students how to search in the databases, I also try as much as I can to incorporate how to interrogate these systems. Especially with my the students that I teach in the social work department. Social workers, just like nurses, have to use evidence-based practice for their care to provide the best quality of care to their patient population. So for social work students who often will not be, sometimes they'll work in a hospital setting or a medical setting, but often they'll be working at a nonprofit setting or in a school setting that doesn't have access to a lot of the paid databases and journals that they'll have access to as long as they're students here at the university. So I show them that. I often ask how often they've hit a paywall. Students sometimes will give up on finding an article if they hit a paywall, which I tell them absolutely do not give up, especially while you're a student. You can request things through interlibrary loan, but another resource that I show them is open access resources, like the directory of open access repositories, open access journals, and other resources and ways to find materials that are free to access, which is especially important for those that have to provide evidence-based care. And this is another way of sort of introducing this critique of these oppressive systems that exist. The capitalist countries that are, or companies, not countries, capitalist companies that are profiting off of these high subscription costs to these journals. So starting to show them how to critique that, interrogate that, and as well as the algorithms that are showing them these results, which can be demonstrated in Google, but it can also be demonstrated in a database like PsycInfo. So with that, I wanted to provide a list of books for you all. I shared these slides to the website, so the list is on there, and there's some other, there's also articles here as well as books for folks to look through, and again, this is all linked on the website. And then I wanted to close with another quote from Bell Hooks and then open it up for questions. So this is the last Bell Hooks quote, I promise. To commit ourselves to the work of transforming the academy so that it will be a place where cultural diversity informs every aspect of our learning, we must embrace struggle and sacrifice. We cannot be easily discouraged. We cannot despair when there is conflict. Our solidarity must be affirmed by shared belief in a spirit of intellectual openness that celebrates diversity, welcomes dissent, and rejoices in collective dedication to truth. So with that, I wanted to open it up for folks to ask questions.
Well, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I know I wrote down some things that I'm definitely going to switch up for my teaching. We did have a specific question in the chat about how you advertise your general sessions, which I'm curious about as well, when you open yourself up and make yourself available.
Sure. So for the general sessions, actually, as well as the specific sessions on specific databases, I would post it to our library calendar page. So we have a library workshops and events page that's on our main homepage. People can see things that are upcoming. And when they link into the calendar, they can see other things that are coming up. But I would also reach out to the department. So I would reach out to any contacts that I had in the department, so instructors that I'd worked with in the past, as well as the current dean. Some departments have rotating like chairs of the department, so I would contact whoever was the chair for that year and ask them. I would also reach out to them individually and just ask if they knew specific instructors I could reach out to. I would often reach out to in the social work department, especially all of the adjunct instructors, because a lot of them would, especially when we shifted to remote work, they were especially appreciative of this this help of having librarians step in and teach students how to start searching these databases, which really helped set up the course for success, because now students had the tools they needed to find the articles they would need to cite in their papers and assignments. So reaching out to all those different groups and stakeholders really helps. And then keeping it, of course, on our library calendar events page.
Great. And we had a little bit of a follow-up on that. And I hope that they also asked a little bit about how you plan those workshops, and also how long they are.
Sure. So for the most part, I kept the workshops at about, I would try to keep them under an hour, which for the database searching workshops, that was really difficult. But I would try as best as I could to keep them under an hour, especially because I wanted to build in time for questions. And also I wanted to let people leave a little early if they could, understanding that there's a lot going on in everyone's lives, and students have all of these online Zoom sessions and Zoom meetings, and we know Zoom fatigue is real. But I planned them based on how I taught them before, and I actually learned by doing. So some of the things that used to make sense in an in-person environment didn't make so much sense in an online environment. But the ability to share screens and asking students to share their screens to show me how they work through things, that really helped a lot. And then the other way that I would plan sessions, if I was asked to come into a classroom, I would ask the professors to share with me as much as they possibly could. So I would ask them to share me what's the assignment that they're all working on? What are some of the topics students have shared with you? So getting as much information from the professors as possible, which some professors weren't as responsive to or didn't have time to respond to. I would plan my sessions around that as much as possible. If professors didn't have as much time, which especially for the adjunct instructors who work as full-time social workers and teach, I created a very brief 3-question survey, and all the questions were optional, and just asked the professor to share them with their students. And then I would get the information directly from the students and plan my session around that. So for students who are a lot more knowledgeable, who are using PsycInfo and Web of Science, I could do a lot more in-depth advanced searching. For students who use Google Scholar or Google and have never used a database before, I could start building from there. So that helped a lot with planning the instruction sessions.
Thank you. And it looks like Margaret Henderson has her hand up. Margaret, are you able to share via microphone, or would you like to type in the chat? I think her microphone's disabled. Margaret, could you share in the chat your question? Oh, she said that was her mistake. I think that's all the questions that came in on chat. Did I miss any? I know Rachel was watching with me.
I don't think you missed any questions. There were some really good comments towards the beginning about the different ways to address the cameras, which was already addressed in the presentation, but some really great comments about that. And I don't.
Yeah, I see some of those. Yeah, so again, bringing it back to that, making it very clear that it's optional, and being understanding of students who, for whatever reason, there's a variety of reasons that students might not want to have their camera on.
And we just got another question in. Critical pedagogy appears to require some vulnerability. Is there a way to balance vulnerability with a little more reserve?
Yeah, I think that as far as, I don't think that you have to disclose anything that you don't feel comfortable disclosing. And like I said earlier, there's some things that you disclose just by virtue of being a body in this space. I have a lot of scars from my past, and so it's way more obvious when I'm in person. But just by virtue of that, like, it's kind of already making me have to accept that vulnerability and live with that. And for some of my colleagues who are for my BIPOC librarians, just by virtue of them being in this space, like, oh, this is a Black librarian teaching this course. For a lot of students, it can really be helpful because they're seeing someone who looks like them. But that also opens them up to microaggressions and inadvertent acts of racism, which we know impact matters more than intent. So I would say that it's still up to the instructor and the person in that space to decide how vulnerable to be and to make choices about what you're bringing into the classroom. Like I feel very comfortable calling out things like microaggressions or pointing out things that students are doing, but another instructor might not feel as comfortable doing that.
Thank you.
Did that answer the question? I think ultimately it's your choice is the short answer.
Well, it was a very thorough presentation with some great resources. I took a picture of your slide with all the books on it. So I read for your, I'll never know how to say his name, but I haven't read Bell Hooks's book, so I'm going to read that next.
Bell Hooks is great. She also has this really great book on feminism called Feminism is for Everybody, which is very easy to read, and it's a really great introduction to feminism.
Very cool. Well, Holliday, this was really informative and very much appreciated. Do we have any other questions that we want to submit before we let Holliday go? Well, we are so appreciative, and thank you so much for coming and sharing with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, I appreciate it. And my email, I'll just type my email into the chat.
Great,
if anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm really happy to connect with folks.